Hey everyone! Today we're diving into one of the most intense and chaotic periods in English history, the Danish Conquest of England. Now, this wasn't just a single invasion, but a series of major Viking attacks between 1013 and 1016 that ultimately overthrew the English rulers of the time. It was during this period that four Danish kings actually took control of England from 1013 to 1042. It all started when the Danish king, Sweyn Forkbeard, launched an invasion in 1013, forcing the English king, Athelred the Unready, to flee. But after Sweyn died in 1014, Athelred came back to reclaim his throne with some force behind him. However, Sweyn's son, Cnut the Great, wasn't going to let that stand. He fought against Athelred, and later, his successor Edmund Ironside. In fact, it was after Cnut defeated Edmund at the Battle of Essendon in 1016 that he became the second Danish king of England. Cnut didn't stop there though. At the height of his reign in the late 1020s, he was ruling over not just England, but Denmark and Norway too, and had his hands deep in European politics. After Cnut's death, his sons, Harald Harefoot and Harthacnut, took turns ruling England for a few more years. But by the time Harthacnut died in 1042, the Danish dynasty had pretty much come to an end, and Athelred's line was restored when Edward the Confessor took the throne. Even so, the effects of the Danish conquest still lingered, especially when new Scandinavian claimants started threatening England during the Norman conquest that followed. Now, to really understand why this Danish invasion happened, you have to know that the Vikings weren't strangers to England. Even though we often associate them with Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, by the time of the Danish conquest, Viking influence had spread all across Northern Europe, and even into North America. They had settled in Iceland, Greenland, and parts of North America like Newfoundland. Viking raids on England actually went way back to the late 8th century. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, including the famous Alfred the Great of Wessex, had been fighting off Viking raids for years. By the 10th century, the Kingdom of England as we know it began to take shape, but it was constantly threatened by Scandinavian rulers. After a brief lull in Viking activity in the 960s and 970s, smaller raids started up again in the 980s, setting the stage for the massive Danish invasions that were about to follow. In 991, the Danish warlord Olaf Tryggvason, who later became the King of Norway, led a massive fleet to England and defeated local forces at the Battle of Malden. A few years later, Sweyn Forkbeard joined in, leading another invasion in 994. King Athelred couldn't stop them militarily, so he paid them off with tribute in both 991 and 984, which temporarily stopped their raiding. But things didn't stay quiet for long. Sweyn returned with more Viking armies in 1003 and 1006, and another warlord, Thorkel the Tall, took over much of England from 1009 to 1012. Even though there were a few small victories for the English during this time, like when an English noble named Ulf Seidel weakened Sweyn's army in 1004, overall, England's defenses were crumbling. The English tried paying more tribute in 1002, 1007, and 1012 just to buy themselves some time to recover, but the situation kept getting worse. England's attempts to mount a united defense were plagued by infighting and lack of coordination. Even when Athelred launched a huge shipbuilding campaign in 1009 to defend the kingdom, the effort fell apart because of internal squabbles. The country was in total disarray, and that chaos made it easier for the Danes to make their move. So, by 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard was back with another invasion, and this time he wasn't messing around. Thorkel the Tall, who had originally been fighting against him, had actually switched sides by then, thanks to some tribute payments from Athelred. Sweyn started by securing the northern part of England first, and as he moved south, more and more local leaders just gave in rather than keep fighting. Even in the heart of Wessex, Sweyn's advance went pretty much unchallenged. By the end of 1013, even Athelred realized the situation was hopeless. He sent his family into exile in Normandy and followed them not long after. With Athelred out of the picture, Sweyn was now the undisputed ruler of England. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he was fully acknowledged as king, and to solidify his power even further, Sweyn brought his son, Cnut, along during the campaign and arranged for Cnut to marry Elfgifu of Northampton, who came from a powerful family that had been in conflict with Athelred for years. This marriage was a strategic move, setting up Cnut to take over once Sweyn was gone. But things took an unexpected turn when Sweyn died suddenly in February 1014. Cnut was quickly proclaimed king by his Viking fleet, but his influence wasn't strong enough to win over everyone in England. Some of the English nobles saw this as their chance to bring Athelred back. They reached out to him, promising they'd support his return if he ruled more fairly and forgave their past betrayals. Athelred agreed, came back with an army, and launched an attack on Cnut's base in Lindsey. He pretty much wiped out Cnut's local support, burning and plundering everything in sight, though Cnut himself managed to escape. At this point, Athelred seemed to be back in control, with support from the Norwegian warlord Olaf Haraldsson and maybe even Thorkel the Tall still on his side. But Athelred didn't waste time taking revenge. In 1015, he had 2 northern nobles assassinated at an assembly in Oxford, men he believed had been disloyal to him. So, while he had driven Cnut out, he was also being ruthless toward his own people. Then came the next twist. In 1015, Athelred's son, Edmund, rebelled against his father. Around the same time, Athelred fell seriously ill, leaving the kingdom divided and vulnerable once again. Sensing an opportunity, Cnut returned to England with another army and began raiding the countryside. He also managed to win over Edric Striona, a powerful and notorious noble who had a reputation for switching sides whenever it suited him. Edmund, realizing the threat, began gathering his own forces, but he didn't face Cnut directly at first. By early 1016, though, things were looking grim. Cnut and Edric had the upper hand, and Edmund decided it was time to reconcile with his father. Together, they prepared to confront Cnut. But before they could act, Athelred died in London, leaving Edmund to take up the fight alone. Edmund was quickly proclaimed king and launched a series of fierce battles against Cnut. He fought him at Penselwood, Schurston, Brentford, and Otford, and depending on the sources, these were either victories or stalemates for the English. Edmund was clearly giving it his all, and for a moment it looked like he might be able to turn the tide. But the decisive moment came at the Battle of Asandun on October 18, 1016. Both armies were massive, and the stakes were incredibly high. Edmund was hoping to pull off a victory like his father had in 1014, but this time Cnut came out on top. Edmund's forces were almost completely wiped out. Still, Edmund himself survived, but most of England's remaining leadership had fallen in the battle, leaving him with very little support. Realizing he couldn't continue the fight, Edmund decided to negotiate with Cnut. Not long after, though, Edmund died, and with his death, Cnut became the undisputed ruler of England. With Athelred and Edmund both gone, Cnut finally became the undisputed king of England. To secure his rule, he made a strategic move by marrying Emma of Normandy, who was actually Athelred's widow. Now, even though Cnut was already married to Elfgifu of Northampton, marrying Emma linked him to the Old English dynasty, which helped legitimize his claim. However, Cnut wasn't just about forming alliances. Several key figures from Athelred's time, like Uhtred the Bold, Edric Striona, and Athelred's son Edwig, were executed as Cnut consolidated power. In their place, Cnut started installing a new group of loyal supporters. Thorkel the Tall, who had switched sides during the earlier conflicts, was made Earl of East Anglia. Eric Håkonsson from Norway replaced Uhtred in Northumbria, and an up-and-coming English lord, Godwin, began rising to power in the south. Cnut's reign wasn't just about controlling England. His brother Harold died without children in 1018, making Cnut the king of Denmark too. Throughout the 1020s, Cnut spent his time traveling between Denmark and England, figuring out how to govern both kingdoms. He even added Norway to his list of territories in 1028 after defeating a coalition of Scandinavian rivals. By 1030, Cnut had established a solid network of rulers across his realms. Godwin became one of the most powerful figures in England, while Cnut's first wife, Elfgifu, ruled Norway alongside their son, Sven. Denmark, meanwhile, was under the care of Harthacnut, Cnut's son with Emma. Cnut didn't just stay within his kingdoms either. He traveled to Rome in 1027 to attend the coronation of Conrad II as Holy Roman Emperor, where he also negotiated with Pope John XIX. This was significant because while previous English kings had made pilgrimages to Rome, Cnut's political involvement there was on a whole new level. But by the time Cnut died in late 1035, the empire he'd built was already showing cracks. Elfgifu had been overthrown in Norway, and her son Sven died around the same time. This left Harthacnut in charge of Denmark, but England faced a messy succession struggle. The question was whether Harthacnut would also rule England or if Harold Harefoot, Cnut's son with Elfgifu, would take the throne. Harold was older and had support in central and northern England, while Harthacnut had the backing of Wessex and his stepmother Emma of Normandy, with Godwin supporting him as well. In the end, Harthacnut didn't show up to claim England, and Harold Harefoot was crowned in 1037. His reign isn't well documented, but one notable event was his decision to exile Emma, who had been spreading rumors that Harold wasn't actually Cnut's son. Harold also fended off attacks from Athelred's exiled sons, Edward the Confessor and Alfred. Alfred was caught and brutally blinded by Harold's forces, leading to his death. Harold Harefoot died in 1040, still a young man. Although he had a son, Harthacnut was the obvious choice to take over, especially with his fleet ready in Denmark. Harthacnut came to England and claimed the throne, uniting Denmark and England once more, but his rule was far from smooth. Known for being brutal and imposing high taxes, he quickly became unpopular. One of his most notorious acts was digging up Harold's body, mutilating it, and throwing it into the Thames as a form of posthumous revenge. By 1042, Harthacnut was sick and struggling to maintain his power. Realizing things weren't going well, he invited his half-brother, Edward the Confessor, to rule alongside him. Not long after, Harthacnut died, and with him, the Danish line in England came to an end. Edward, Athelred's son, would take the throne, bringing the English dynasty back to power until 1066. Even though the Danish rule ended with Harthacnut, the legacy of the conquest lingered. Scandinavian rulers didn't forget about England. Harald Hardrada, the Norwegian king, tried to claim the throne in 1066, while Sven II of Denmark launched an invasion in 1069. Cnut IV even planned another invasion in 1085, although it never happened. But as time passed and the Norman dynasty took hold, the House of Denmark slowly faded from English memory.